On the evening of April 28, 2002, 38-year-old Rhonda Boggs sat on the couch of her mother-in-law's house in the quiet city of Pataskala, Ohio, nervously watching the clock. At her feet, her 2.5-year-old daughter, Amanda, was playing with a stuffed animal. It was 6:30 p.m., and Rhonda's husband, Dave, was supposed to call any minute. Dave was currently being incarcerated at the county jail. Dave had been sentenced to 2 weeks behind bars for failing to pay child support to one of his exes. And while Rhonda was obviously not thrilled about this, she also knew she should not be surprised. When Rhonda had first met Dave about 12 years earlier, it was his carefree personality that she had really fallen in love with. He was in a rock band, and she had loved going to his shows and dancing in the front row. It all felt glamorous and exciting and like they were going to stay young forever. But now they were both 38, with a toddler to look after, and bills to pay. And Dave, he really just kept on partying and playing rock star, while all their responsibilities sort of fell to Rhonda. She had barely been to any of his shows since Amanda had been born, in part because it wasn't really the kind of scene you could bring a baby to. A lot of the guys Dave hung around with were hard drinkers and drug addicts and ex-cons. And so now, after almost 4 years of marriage, Rhonda was finally starting to see Dave for what he was, which was not carefree. Dave was really just kind of reckless. The phone rang and Rhonda picked it up. And as expected, it was Dave. And what Rhonda really wanted to say to him was that she was upset and seriously considering divorce, and that in fact, she'd already taken his name off her retirement plan. But at the same time, she saw her mother-in-law standing in the doorway, clearly listening, and so instead of saying what she really wanted to say, she just said, "Hey Dave, how are you doing?" An hour later, back at her own home, Rhonda put a casserole into the oven, and then she turned on cartoons for Amanda, and then went outside to mow the lawn before it got too dark. Rhonda was used to doing almost everything around the house herself, since Dave was practically never home anyway. But now that he was, in jail, she had to literally do everything, including, mowing the grass on a Sunday night. So Rhonda wheeled the lawnmower out of the garage and into the yard, and then she pulled the cord to start the engine. But like everything else in their little house, the lawnmower was on the verge of breaking down, and it kept shutting off. While Rhonda struggled, she noticed her neighbor coming out of the house across the street, and he waved to Rhonda as he came down his own driveway, sort of telling her like, hey, turn off that lawnmower. And once she did, and once it was quiet enough to actually hear each other, he shouted from across the street and asked if she wanted to borrow his lawnmower that did work. Rhonda found herself looking around the yard at all the tall grass and saw how dark it was already getting. And then she checked her watch and saw that, her casserole was going to be done in just a minute here. And so she said to her neighbor that she really appreciated the offer, but it didn't really matter because, you know what, she doesn't have time to do this anyways. She has to go back inside. So Rhonda said bye to her neighbor and then pushed her defective lawnmower back inside the garage. And then she made a mental note to call Dave's cousin, Nick, the following day to see if maybe he could come by and fix her lawnmower. Nick worked as a maintenance man at a big apartment complex, and even though he lived 45 minutes away, he'd been helping Rhonda around the house while Dave was behind bars. Just last week, he had fixed up her washing machine, and he called all the time just to check in. And so now, Rhonda went back inside the house, into the kitchen, and took the casserole out of the oven just before the timer rang. She cut the casserole into 2 pieces and brought those pieces into the dining room and set them on the table. Then she walked over and turned off the TV, scooped up her daughter, and brought her over to the table. It was getting late, and all Rhonda really wanted to do here was just eat quickly and go to bed. But for every bite that made it into Amanda's mouth, another wound up on the floor. And so Rhonda knew that, at the end of dinner, she would have to do another round of cleanup before she could finally go to sleep. But Rhonda knew, Amanda couldn't help it. She was a little kid. And so she reached over and took her daughter's fork and began helping her eat, to not only minimize the mess, but also to help her kid out. And in reality, Amanda was actually the thing preventing Rhonda from just pulling the trigger on a divorce. She didn't know if she could handle being a single mother. It was hard enough having Dave gone for a few weeks, that she couldn't even imagine doing this all alone by herself forever. And since she already knew Dave was bad at paying child support, as that is the reason he was in jail right now, she figured if she was a single mom, even if he was ordered to pay her, she would likely have to rely on paying the bills herself. She would need to get a job and make money. Now, Rhonda did have a job now as an office assistant, but she wasn't sure if that would be enough to fully support herself and her daughter without any additional financial help. But just then, as Rhonda was scooping up another bite of casserole for her daughter, She heard a noise outside that almost sounded like heavy footsteps. She turned around, and through the curtains, she could see the silhouette of a person clearly coming up her driveway. The next morning, Monday, April 29th, Rhonda's coworker, Gary Pulowski, noticed that Rhonda was running late for her shift in the office at Hamilton Home Products, which was a heating equipment company. And this was strange because Rhonda had actually never been late before in the entire time that she had worked there. So Gary began asking around to see if anybody knew where Rhonda was or if maybe she'd called in or something. But his coworkers all shrugged and said they hadn't heard from her since she left the office on Friday night. And so eventually, Gary tried calling Rhonda's landline at her house to see if she was home. But after calling several times, Rhonda never picked up. He waited for a while to see if maybe she would call back, but when he still hadn't heard from her after an hour, he started to worry that, she might have run into car trouble, like maybe she was stranded somewhere with her car. He knew it was about a 15-mile drive from her house in Pataskala to the office here, just outside of Columbus. And back in 2002, not everyone had a cell phone, and he didn't know if she did. So if her car had broken down, she might be stranded without a way to call for help. And so Gary decided he would just get in his own car and drive the route from the office back to her house to literally see if he could find Rhonda on the side of the road. Gary drove all the way out to Pataskala, keeping his eyes peeled for Rhonda's car on the side of the road, but there was no sign of it. It was not until he finally turned the corner onto Rhonda's street that he saw her car, and her car was parked in the driveway of her white-paneled one-story house. And at this, Gary's stomach kind of balled up into a knot, because he realized that, Rhonda had clearly not left for work at all. And he knew that if she had just stayed home this whole time without calling in or calling anybody back, that something bad had to have happened. And so Gary pulled up to her house, and he got out of his car and walked up to the front door, and he knocked, but there was no answer. So after a minute, he went around and knocked on the back door, and there was still no answer back there either. So he walked back around to the front of the house, and he was about to leave when he saw the drapes rustling in one of the front windows. He squinted at the window, and he saw, what was causing the movement of the drapes was Rhonda's toddler daughter, Amanda, looking out the window. And her face was red like she'd been crying for a long time. And so now, Gary started to panic. But he tried to keep his voice calm as he ran over and shouted through the window and told Amanda he was a friend of her mother's and convinced her to open the door so he could help her. It took a minute for Amanda to figure out what Gary was asking, but eventually she got it, and she disappeared from the window, and a moment later, the front door opened. And so Gary walked over and he stepped through the front door, and the first thing he saw were bloody footprints on the living room carpet. Gary instinctively scooped Amanda up in his arms, and he ran across the street, banged on the neighbor's door, and told them to call the police. Not long after, Pataskala police would arrive at Rhonda's house, and they would search the inside, and they would find Rhonda, and she was found stabbed to death in her own kitchen. This was the first homicide in Pataskala in 6 years, and there were only 17 officers in the whole police department, and the crime scene unit was run out of a refurbished ambulance. So, Police Chief Chris Forshee didn't have a ton of resources to throw at this case. But he called in all available officers and sent them to the crime scene. And then he headed out there himself to make sure they did the job right. By the time Forshee pulled up to the house, his officers had already sealed off the perimeter. He ducked under the crime scene tape, walked inside the house, and followed the sound of footsteps and clicking cameras into the kitchen, where a woman was lying in a pool of blood on the tile floor. An officer told Forshee that the victim had been identified as Rhonda Boggs, and it was her coworker who had come to check on her when she hadn't shown up for work that morning that ultimately prompted a 911 call that led to the discovery of the body. The officer also told Forshee that Rhonda's toddler daughter had been found, uninjured, in the house with her body. And so Forshee knelt down to examine the body. And right away, he saw at least, more than a dozen stab wounds on Rhonda's head, her neck, her chest, and her shoulders. The sheer number of wounds and the blood all over the kitchen suggested there had to have been a struggle, and that from the looks of it, Rhonda had fought very hard with her attacker. The remnants of what appeared to be a casserole were sitting on the stove, and Rhonda was fully dressed. So Forshee figured the crime must have happened sometime before she went to bed, so between dinner and bedtime. And then Forshee wondered if, her poor daughter had been awake, or maybe even in the room when this happened. After the scene had been photographed, Forshee gave the green light for the coroner to actually physically lift Rhonda's body up off the ground onto a stretcher. And when the coroner's staff hoisted her up, Forshee noticed something lying underneath her body. It was a steak knife with blood all over the blade. Forshee looked around the kitchen and realized the black handle on that knife matched the set of knives on the countertop. It appeared that Rhonda had been killed with a knife from her own kitchen, which meant her killer did not show up to the house with their murder weapon. This suggested that this murder was likely a heat-of-the-moment crime rather than something that had been planned out. While Forshee's officers finished collecting forensic evidence in the kitchen, Forshee himself walked through the rest of the house. It looked like it had been completely ransacked. The jewelry box in the bedroom was empty, and the dresser drawers were open, and piles of Rhonda's clothes were strewn all over the floor. And then in the dining room, they found a purse that had been overturned with all of its contents spilled out, and clearly it looked like somebody had been sifting through it. And so Forshee thought that, between the sort of ransacked appearance of the house and also the weapon of opportunity, that it seemed like this could have been a robbery gone wrong. However, there was one factor that did seem to complicate things, or at least make it seem like this could have been something else, and that was that there was no sign of forced entry. Just then, Forshee heard a commotion near the front door, and so he walked over, and he saw there was a woman trying to push her way into the house, and her face was all red, and she was crying, and she was shouting at the officers, demanding to know what happened. Forshee took this woman outside and tried to calm her down, and she would eventually tell him that her name was Kim Davis and she was Rhonda's sister. Once she'd caught her breath, Forshee explained to her what he already knew, which was that unfortunately her sister Rhonda had been found stabbed to death inside of her home, and the running theory at this point, at least his theory, was this was a robbery gone wrong. And potentially, because there was no sign of forced entry, it could indicate that it was somebody that, Rhonda potentially knew and who she would have, let into the house if she saw them. Now, Kim was obviously extremely upset by this, and so for a minute, Forshee just consoled her, but he really needed to kind of press this investigation, and so once she had kind of calmed down a little bit, he asked her if she knew of anybody who might have wanted to hurt Rhonda. And Kim immediately said no. She couldn't imagine her sister having any enemies. But after sitting with that question for a moment, Kim said that actually there was one person who might have had a problem with Rhonda, and that was her husband, Dave. Kim said that Rhonda and Dave's marriage had been on the rocks for a while, and in fact, Rhonda had told her recently that she was thinking about getting a divorce. But Kim said, Dave actually is currently in jail, so I don't see how he could have done this. He was literally in jail at the time this happened. Still though, she thought it was possible that, Dave could have been involved one way or another. He might have paid somebody to come here and do this, or maybe put one of his friends up to it. Forshee promised Kim he would look into this, but he was already feeling pretty skeptical. I mean, if Dave couldn't even pay child support, what was the likelihood that he was able to afford a hitman? And also, the murder weapon appeared to come from Rhonda's kitchen, and so that didn't really suggest that the suspect had been planning to kill her when they got there. So again, sort of takes away from the idea that a hitman was used in this murder. But at this point, Forshee thought their best chance to figure out what actually happened here was actually to speak to the only other person who was at the scene of the crime that they knew about, and that was Rhonda's own 2-year-old daughter, Amanda. Later that day, a social worker from Child Services pulled up outside the house, and Forshee walked out to greet her. And he said to her that before she took custody of Amanda, he was hoping that, she could help him talk to this girl and see what she knew about the murder, because she was here, when it happened, and there was nobody else who witnessed it but her. The social worker nodded, and so Forshee took her across the street to the neighbor's house, where Amanda had been staying all morning. Now, Forshee didn't know if this little girl would be able to tell them anything at all. I mean, of course, she could be in complete shock. She's also 2. And he also knew that even if she did tell them stuff, they wouldn't necessarily be reliable because, again, she's 2 years old and she very likely is in shock. But regardless, Forshee knew he had to try. So he stood in the corner of the living room while the social worker sat down on the floor with Amanda and asked her what she had seen the night before. And to Forshee's surprise, the little girl looked up at the social worker and she jerked her little hand toward her neck in what looked very much like a stabbing motion. And then in a quiet voice, she said her mother had fallen down and gone to sleep. Then the social worker asked her if anybody else had been there. And Forshee felt himself holding his breath, waiting for Amanda to answer. And there was a moment of silence before Amanda said, "Uncle Nick." A few hours later, Chief Forshee was still at the crime scene when two officers pulled up in a cruiser and took this grungy-looking man out of the back seat and escorted him into the house. This was not the Uncle Nick that Amanda had named. It was Amanda's own father, Dave Boggs, who had been in jail when his wife was murdered. Now, Forshee was absolutely planning to speak to this Uncle Nick, but first he wanted to gather as much information as possible about him. During Amanda's conversation with the social worker, she had said repeatedly that Uncle Nick had hurt Mommy. But even though this 2-year-old girl seemed very definitive about this, Forshee needed an adult perspective before he acted. A judge had let Dave Boggs out of jail early because of his wife's murder, and Forshee had ensured that Dave was escorted to the crime scene so Forshee could speak to him before Dave got a chance to speak to anybody else. And so now Forshee met Dave and the officers at the door and then guided them into the living room where they sat Dave down on the couch. They filled him in on what had happened to his wife, but really before he could react to that, they also told him that they needed him to do a walkthrough of the house with them to try to identify what might have been stolen, which could help them figure out who did this. But first, Forshee said he had a very important question. He asked Dave, "Who is Uncle Nick?" And at this, Dave, who to this point had just looked completely shocked by what he was being told, began to look more confused. And he told Forshee that Uncle Nick was what his daughter called his second cousin. He said his real name was Richard Nicholas Robinson, and he had been helping Rhonda out while Dave was in jail. Dave said Nick had probably been at the house almost every day, fixing one thing or another, but he said he didn't understand why Forshee was asking about him because, there's no way he would have hurt Rhonda. I mean, he really looked out for her and also for Amanda. But for now, Forshee was not going to answer that question. Dave's information was enough for him to go outside, get on his radio, and broadcast a bulletin asking all police departments in the area to be on the lookout for Nick Robinson. Less than an hour later, a police cruiser found Nick Robinson's SUV on State Route 37 just outside of Pataskala, and they pulled him over and they ordered him out of the vehicle, and as soon as he was out, they pushed him to the ground with a gun to the back of his head and cuffed him. And as they did this, they noticed a dark spot on Nick's baseball cap that looked a lot like blood. As they put Nick in the back of the cruiser, he kept asking them what was going on, but they didn't tell him. Instead, they searched his SUV, and there was cardboard laid out in the back with reddish-brown smears all over it, which also appeared to be blood. And then when the officers got back into their cruiser, Nick asked them, "Is this about Rhonda?" By the time this arrest happened, Chief Forshee was at Nick Robinson's house questioning his wife, Debbie. So while he did that, he dispatched one of his best and only detectives, Bruce Brooks, to go down to police headquarters to handle Nick's interrogation. When Detective Brooks walked into the interview room, immediately he could see that Nick, who was resting his head in his hands, looked very pale and nauseous. When he asked him if he was okay, Nick said he was just hungover from a long night of drinking. He said he had been at a bar in Columbus until around 10:30 p.m., and then he had gone to another bar in Lancaster, which was a town nearby where he lived. And then he had finally come home around 1:30 a.m. and passed out on his couch. Nick swore he didn't know anything about what happened to Rhonda, and only found out she was dead when he saw it on the news. And as for the blood the police found in his SUV, he said it was just animal blood from a hunting trip. But Brooks was not buying this, because he had heard Amanda, Rhonda's daughter, say Uncle Nick hurts Mom. And while, of course, you can't take a 2-year-old's testimony as absolutely reliable, but when she had said it, she said it very definitively and even gestured at her neck like she was stabbing herself. And Rhonda was found stabbed to death. So he asked Nick, if his alibi essentially was that he was too drunk to have committed this murder. Well, then how could he be sure, given he was too drunk, that he hadn't killed Rhonda in an alcohol-fueled blackout. If he can't remember, it's just as likely that he could have done it. But Nick just shook his head and said no. And no seemed to be Nick's answer to just about every question Brooks asked him. And eventually, the detective got frustrated, because basically everything he asked Nick, he denied. And so eventually he told Nick that Rhonda's daughter had seen the whole thing. And he told him to imagine that little girl on the witness stand, having some defense lawyer poke and prod her about the most traumatic event she had ever experienced, the murder of her own mother. And when he said that, a crack seemed to appear in Nick's sort of outward demeanor of denial. Like clearly he saw how awful this thing really was. And then finally, a little after midnight, so 6 hours into this interrogation, Nick just agreed to take a lie detector test. And when the results came back, it showed very clearly that Nick had failed. He had lied. But instead of confessing at this point, Nick dug in and swore up and down that he really was innocent. So Brooks pulled out the last threat he could think of, which was that if Nick didn't confess now, he could be looking at the death penalty. And at that point, it was very clear. Nick cracked. Like that absolutely affected him. And so after a long silence following this threat of the death penalty, Nick said that, maybe he did have something to do with what happened, but he just couldn't remember it. From there on, Brooks kept on pushing and pushing until around 5 a.m. when Nick finally completely broke down and confessed to the murder. He said he had gone to Rhonda's house in between the 2 bars that he had visited, and he tried to kiss her. She pulled away and she grabbed a knife, and when Nick tried to take the knife from her, he said he accidentally stabbed her. As the sun came up, officers drove Nick to the Licking County Jail and officially booked him for Rhonda's murder. Later that morning, Chief Forshee stood in front of a group of reporters outside the police station and praised his officers for catching Rhonda Boggs' killer and getting a confession in less than 24 hours. But later that week, Detective Brooks was in his office wrapping up paperwork when a secretary stuck her head in the door and said there was somebody on the phone for him. Brooks picked it up, and the man on the other end of the line introduced himself as Bob Sisko. And he said he was the bandmate of Rhonda's husband, Dave Boggs, and he did not think Nick was guilty of this murder. Bob said on the evening that Rhonda was killed, another one of their former bandmates, a guy named Chris Williams, had stopped by his house. And Chris had seemed very nervous and sort of keyed up. He was pacing around and smoking cigarette after cigarette, and it just seemed like he was very mentally preoccupied with something. Now, Bob said Chris had actually in the past already robbed Rhonda and Dave's house. He had stolen a bunch of band equipment and sold it for drug money. And so when Bob Sisko saw on the news that, Rhonda was dead and her house appeared to have been robbed, he couldn't shake this feeling that Chris might have been involved. It just seemed too similar to be a coincidence. Brooks wrote all this down and thanked Bob for the information, but he wasn't sure how seriously to take this tip, since they already had a confession from their primary suspect. But he spoke to Forshee, and the chief decided to go ahead and re-interview Rhonda's 2-year-old daughter, just to cover their bases. A few days later, so about 2 weeks after Rhonda's murder, Chief Forshee waited by the phone in his office, anxiously watching the clock. He knew that the social worker who had spoken to Amanda the first time was in the process of interviewing her a second time. And any minute now, this social worker should be calling him with an update. Now, Forshee was hopeful that the little girl would just repeat the same story that she had told on the day of her mother's murder. But when his phone finally rang and Forshee picked it up, he learned that that is not what happened. The social worker said that this time, when she asked Amanda who she saw on the night of the murder, she did not say anything about Uncle Nick. Instead, she said, Bob did it. When Forshee heard this, he immediately got a pretty anxious feeling. He'd been afraid from the beginning that, a toddler was not a reliable eyewitness, and she could just be throwing out whatever names popped into her head. But he also thought it was a very strange coincidence that of all the people she could have named other than Uncle Nick, she said Bob. The same guy who had just called the station trying to, cast blame onto some other guy the police had never even heard of. Something just felt off. But as Forshee thought about it, he decided, it didn't really change anything. Nick had already confessed, like he said he did this. So they didn't really need Amanda as a witness to make the charges against Nick stick. 5 days later, a grand jury officially indicted Nick on murder charges. And to the huge surprise of investigators, Nick pled not guilty. So he was now claiming he had given a false confession and that he was not Rhonda Boggs' killer. About 7 months later, in December of 2002, a man named Matt Sauer stepped into a bar called Merry Melodies in Columbus, Ohio. He went up to the counter and pulled a manila folder out of his messenger bag, and he asked the bartender if he recognized the man in the photograph inside. The bartender looked down at the photo for a second and then looked back up at Sauer and nodded and said, "Yes, that's Nick Robinson. He was here 8 months ago, on the night of the murder, and I've been waiting for you guys to come here and talk to me about it, because I know he was here on the night of the murder." Sauer was kind of caught off guard by how sure the bartender was, and so he asked them, how can you be so sure it was him, and how do you know he was here on the night of the murder? How can you remember that? But the bartender had a quick answer. He said the reason he remembered Nick is he had been wearing this very unique, unforgettable t-shirt that night with this obscene joke on it about women's bodies, so he just remembered it. Bartender said Nick had stayed there on the night of the murder until 10:15 or maybe 10:30. The bartender was absolutely certain. And so again, the bartender said to Sauer, I'm just pretty surprised it took this long for you all to come here and confirm his whereabouts. I've known this. Sauer closed his folder and thanked the bartender and then just set his business card down on the counter. And when the bartender picked it up, he looked surprised because Matt Sauer was not actually a police officer. He was a private investigator, and he'd been hired by Nick Robinson to clear his name. Sauer knew this was going to be a tough job because Nick had already confessed to Rhonda Boggs' murder. But Sauer was hoping that this interview with the bartender would help him poke a massive hole in the case against him. And so now that Sauer had gotten this testimony from the bartender that did appear to poke this hole in the case, Sauer left the bar, got in his car, and drove to the second bar Nick had claimed to be at on the night of Rhonda's murder. It was called the Fairview Inn in Lancaster. And when he got there, he showed that staff the same photo, and just like the first bartender, they all remembered Nick as well. They said he was there on the night of April 28th, the night of the murder, and they remembered because of his distinctive t-shirt. And so now Sauer knew he was onto something, because the prosecution's case said that Nick had left Merry Melody's bar, that first bar Sauer had gone to, driven to Rhonda's house and killed her, and then went to this bar, the Fairview Inn. But the staff at both bars said Nick was wearing this same distinctive t-shirt. And Sauer knew that if Nick had stabbed Rhonda to death in between these two bars, wouldn't that shirt have been covered in blood? And wouldn't, the Fairview Inn staff have not just remembered that it was this distinctive shirt, but the distinctive shirt that had blood all over it? That would also be a detail they would recall. But they didn't. They just said he had that shirt on, nothing else. A few days later, Sauer drove back to Merry Melody's bar. But this time he didn't go inside. Instead, he just pulled his car into their parking lot and started his stopwatch. And then once it was going, he pulled out of the parking lot, turned down the street, and drove all the way to Fairview Inn. And when he reached their parking lot, he checked his stopwatch, and the drive had taken, about 45 minutes. The prosecution's case against Nick had him leaving Merry Melody's bar, murdering Rhonda, and driving all the way to the Fairview, all within 30 to 45 minutes. But Sauers' experiment here with his stopwatch proved there was simply no way for Nick to have driven all the way to Rhonda's house, committed the murder, and then made it back to the Fairview Inn in that same window of time. It just wasn't possible, which meant Nick's alibi was airtight and he could not have been the killer. Now, Sauer just had to figure out who actually was. Matt Sauer showed the evidence he had found to Nick's defense attorney, who then brought that evidence to the judge in the case, and they also asked the judge for an order to test a key piece of evidence that the Pataskala police had never even sent to the crime lab, the murder weapon. And so the judge agreed to test the knife, and a month later, in January of 2003, the evidence came back from the lab. and they discovered there was DNA on the knife from someone other than Rhonda. Investigators were not sure who the DNA belonged to because back in 2003, it isn't like you had this huge bank to test it against. You basically had to test DNA one-to-one. But they were able to do that with Nick's DNA and were able to confirm that it was not his DNA on the murder weapon. And so this cast serious doubt on Nick as a suspect, but it wasn't enough to clear his name. Not until Sauer could figure out who that other set of DNA belonged to. And so Sauer dug through the police files on the case, and he realized there were a lot of potential suspects the police had never even bothered to look at closely, or at all. There was Rhonda's soon-to-be ex-husband, Dave, who'd been flagged by Rhonda's sister on day one. Dave obviously could not have committed the murder himself because he was in jail. But, like the sister suggested, it's possible he could have recruited somebody else to do it. And so all of Dave's friends, his acquaintances, the people he met in jail potentially, were suspects too. There was also Chris Williams, the former bandmate who had previously robbed Dave and Rhonda's house once before and sold Dave's guitars for drug money. And of course, there was Bob Sisko, the man who had actually called in the tip about Chris. And at one point, Rhonda's own daughter had said Bob had been in the house during the murder. And so maybe that was Bob Sisko. Any of those people could have been Rhonda's killer. But since there was so little investigation done, Sauer was essentially starting over from square one, almost 9 months after the crime. The killer could even be somebody who the police never even knew about, because they had never really even bothered to focus on anybody but Nick. And so with little concrete to go off of, Sauer decided that, before he began investigating 87 different people, he would start with the sort of one concrete thing he had, which is they knew what items had been taken from Rhonda's house during the murder, and so what he decided he would do is try to track down those items, and hopefully they would lead him to the actual killer. A few days later, Sauer stepped into a pawn shop in Columbus and walked slowly down the aisle, scanning the shelves for some of the items that he knew had been taken from Rhonda and Dave's house. But like all the other pawn shops he had been to that day, he hadn't found anything, and when he got to the end of this aisle, he knew this pawn shop as well did not have any of these missing items. Now, it was entirely possible that the items that had been stolen had not been pawned off yet, or maybe they had been pawned off in some other part of the country or something, but it just seemed kind of likely that if they had been pawned, they might be sort of roughly in the area. But so far, he had not found anything promising. And so after leaving this pawn shop and going to another and then another and still not finding any of the stolen items, Sauer finally decided to call it a day and head back home. However, on his ride back home, Sauer found himself stopped at a stoplight. And as he was idling there, he just happened to look out the window, and on the other side of the road, he saw a Bureau of Motor Vehicles, a DMV. And when he saw the DMV, it was like something kind of rattled loose in his mind. He remembered that one of the persons of interest on his list had been arrested for car theft about a week after Rhonda's murder. But according to the police files, that suspect owned a car of their own, a blue Cadillac. So why would they need to steal another car if they already owned one? And so on a whim, Sauer pulled into the parking lot of this DMV. He went inside, and he went up to one of the clerks, and he asked them to look into this particular blue Cadillac. He gave the clerk the license plate number, and he quickly found out that on April 30th, 2002, so one day after Rhonda's body had been found, that blue Cadillac had been sold to a woman in Columbus whose name was Letitia Gordon. And so Sauer left the DMV and drove straight to Letitia's house, and he knocked on the door. And the woman who opened it looked a bit scared when he introduced himself as an investigator, but she also did not seem surprised. Letitia told Sauer that she knew why he was there. It was because of the blue Cadillac that she had bought. She said that she had bought that car off a stranger right off the street who had offered to sell it to her for just $300, something she couldn't pass up. However, when she got home with this new car, she looked inside of it, and she found there was all this stuff piled up in the back of the car, which included clothes, jewelry, and a purse with somebody's photo ID inside. And the name on that ID was Rhonda Boggs. And so, with his suspicions now confirmed, Sauer was finally able to reconstruct what really happened to Rhonda Boggs on the night of April 28, 2002. On that night, while Rhonda Boggs was finishing up dinner with her 2-year-old daughter, her killer was parking their blue Cadillac just down the block. They eventually got out and stormed over to Rhonda's house in a total fury, with their heart pounding and their heads swimming, and they stomped up her driveway and they rang the doorbell. And when Rhonda opened up the door, she looked confused and a bit scared to see this person. She asked them what they were doing there, but the killer just brushed past her and stormed into her house, into the kitchen, and began digging through her purse right on the counter. Rhonda tried to stop them, but when she put her hands on them, the killer, without any hesitation, grabbed a nearby steak knife and stabbed Rhonda in the chest. Rhonda, she fell to the ground and tried to stand back up and tried to defend herself, but the killer was on top of her, stabbing her over and over and over again until Rhonda was no longer moving. The killer at that point stood up and backed away from Rhonda's body, which was now lying there in a pool of blood on the kitchen tile, and then they just proceeded to ransack the house and stole whatever money and valuables they could find, and then as they were about to leave, they saw a toddler just standing in the hallway, watching them. The killer paid the child no mind and just hurried right past them out of the house, got back into their blue Cadillac, and spent the rest of the night on a massive drug binge. And then the next morning, they sold that blue Cadillac to a woman in Columbus on the street, accidentally leaving Rhonda's stolen purse, her ID, and jewelry in the back of that car. And nearly a year later, those items would lead investigators to the killer. The killer was Chris Williams, Dave Boggs' former bandmate who had robbed him and Rhonda once before. On the night of the murder, he was high on crack and needed money for his next hit, and Rhonda unfortunately got in the way. Chris was charged with Rhonda's murder, and on March 28, 2005, he was found guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to 20 years to life for Rhonda's murder and a total of 28 years for aggravated robbery, burglary, and escaping from a halfway house. After Chris Williams was charged, all the charges against Nick Robinson were dropped. And for Nick Robinson, this completely changed his life, not just because now he was free, but once he came back home, he stopped drinking and he returned to work, and he sued the city of Pataskala for $3 million in damages. On Sunday, August 26, 1990, a 56-year-old woman named Patricia Powell and her husband, Frank, pulled into a parking lot outside of this beautiful 3-story white apartment building in Gainesville, Florida. Gainesville is this beautiful little town in northern Florida that is home to the massive University of Florida, which is known for their big-time football team and their big-time college party scene. Patricia and Frank's daughter, 17-year-old Christine, was going to be a freshman that year at the University of Florida. And apparently she had been so excited after getting her acceptance letter that her dad, Frank, had gone out and got a gold necklace for her that had the school's mascot, an alligator, dangling from it. And apparently Christine wore this all the time. 2 days earlier, Christine and her new roommate, 18-year-old Sonia Larson, the two had actually met over the summer when they took some summer classes together. They had actually already come to Gainesville and they had moved in to this white apartment complex that Patricia and Frank were now parked outside of. And after unpacking some of their things in their apartment, Christine and Sonia had left and gone into town and grabbed a bite to eat at a local restaurant. And then afterwards, Christine had used a payphone to call back home and tell her parents how well it was going and how much she already enjoyed her roommate and how excited she was for the year. And she told Patricia and Frank that she would call them the following day. But the following day came and went, and Patricia and Frank did not hear from their daughter. And they had no way to actually call her because she had not set up her landline in her apartment. But Patricia and Frank, they told each other that, of course, everything was fine. You know, she just got to college, she's excited, she's probably out having a good time, and she just forgot to call. And anyways, Patricia and Frank had already planned a visit to see their daughter in Gainesville the next day, which was Sunday. And so fast forward back to that Sunday, and Patricia and Frank are now parked outside of their daughter's apartment complex. They still haven't heard from her, but they're still telling themselves everything's fine. She's probably just busy. And so they get out of their car and they walk over to the building and they go through one of the front access doors that brings them into the building. They find themselves inside of this carpeted stairwell where at every level on the way up, there were doors leading off to each of the apartments. They made their way up to the second level where they knew their daughter's apartment was. And they walk up to her door, and before they even knock or turn the doorknob or anything, they notice on the door there are all these notes, these handwritten notes that have been taped all over it. And they read a couple of them, and they were notes from some of Christine and Sonia's friends on campus that apparently had tried to stop by over the last weekend, but had not been able to make contact with Christine or Sonia. And so these notes said things like, "Hey, Christine, we came over to try to get you to come out with us, but you didn't come to the door, so we left without you. Sorry, give us a call when you get in." And so obviously the parents are totally worried given the circumstances. They don't know where their daughter is. They've been telling themselves everything is fine, and now these notes make it seem like everything is not fine. But the parents, they keep their cool and they just start knocking on the door and calling out for their daughter. But there's no answer. And so Patricia and Frank, they start to panic at this point and they leave the carpeted stairwell. They go outside and they find a maintenance worker that works for this building. And they explain their situation with their daughter and how they can't get in touch with her. And can he please let them in to make sure she's okay? The maintenance worker said he couldn't without speaking to his manager. And so he goes to his manager, and the manager, she says, "That's fine, but we need to get the police involved. They need to escort us into the apartment." And so the maintenance worker calls the police and requests this escort, and a few minutes later, a single Gainesville police officer arrives at the apartment complex. And he tells Patricia and Frank that just as a precaution, I need you guys to stay outside. So they stay right outside those front access doors. They're outside of the apartment building. And then this officer, along with the maintenance worker and the manager of the building, those three, they go inside the stairwell. They go up to the second floor. And at that point, the maintenance worker gets out his keys. He finds the right one, and he opens Christine and Sonia's door. The door swings open, and immediately the police officer yells out for the two girls, but there's no answer. And so the officer is first into the apartment, which basically immediately opens up to their living room. And in the middle of the living room is a couch that's angled towards the right side of the room where a TV had been set up. And so the officer, again, as he walks in, he's calling out, trying to get the girl's attention, but there's no answer. Behind him is the maintenance worker and the building manager, and they begin making their way towards the right side of the living room, over towards that TV, to see if maybe someone was laying on the couch. And as they round that corner and can finally actually see the front of the couch, the maintenance worker, after seeing what he saw, screams out and runs out of the apartment. He runs down the stairs, out the access doors, and begins vomiting on the grass and sobbing right next to Frank and Patricia. Naturally, Frank and Patricia, after seeing this, are immediately concerned that something's wrong with their daughter. And so they run inside, they go up the stairs, and they start running into the apartment. And the police officer and the building manager, they try to stop them from getting in, but there was nothing stopping them. They managed to push past those two. They get into the living room and they're calling out for their daughter. And eventually they make their way over to the side of the couch and they see their daughter, Christine. She is lying on the ground in front of the couch. She's on her back. She has no clothes on, and she's been stabbed to death. And whoever has killed her has positioned her in this very suggestive, sexual, lewd position, as if they were trying to demean her as much as possible and shock whoever found her. And so after these totally devastated and wrecked parents are escorted out of the apartment, this one police officer, he continues searching the apartment. And so he searches the rest of the first floor. There's no sign of Sonia. He goes upstairs and he finds Sonia. She's laying on her bed. She also has no clothes on. She's been stabbed to death, and she's positioned on the side of the bed in a sort of suggestive, lewd position, much like Christine downstairs. It would later be determined that Christine had been sexually assaulted, but Sonia had not been. The officer at this point leaves the apartment. He goes outside. He walks past the grieving parents who are being consoled by the building manager and the maintenance worker. And the officer goes over to his car and he uses his radio to call in for backup. A forensics team comes out to the apartment and they begin processing the scene. And right away, they discover on the outside of the door frame of the door leading into the apartment, there were markings on the edge that looked like someone had used a screwdriver or some similar instrument to pop open the door. They also found there was a towel and some soap that was lying on the ground near Christine's body and near the couch that had apparently been used to both clean Christine's body and also clean some other parts of the apartment. And so they believe this was done to try to intentionally destroy evidence, suggesting the killer or killers were somewhat sophisticated. They also discovered there was some residue on Christine's wrists that indicated at some point her hands had been bound by duct tape. But when she was found, her hands were not bound and there was no duct tape from her wrists. And so whoever had done this had at some point removed the duct tape and taken it away. And so investigators believed that the killer or killers had used the duct tape to immobilize Christine for the attack. And then after she was deceased, they had removed that tape in order to be able to get her arms up over her head, which seemed to increase the shock value of this lewd position they had put her in. Based on what they saw inside of this apartment, the police were convinced they were up against a group of killers or a killer that had targeted these two girls. That this was not some random attack, that this was calculated, this was on purpose, and if they didn't get caught, they were going to strike again. And so even though the police really didn't have any leads to operate on, they just had this crime scene and they were looking for maybe someone with duct tape and a knife and a screwdriver. I mean, that was really about it at this point. And so even though they have virtually nothing, because there were thousands and thousands of young people flooding Gainesville for the start of the new school year at the University of Florida, literally the following day, Monday, classes were starting. Because of all these young people in town, the police felt it was very important that they got the media to put out a bulletin to all these people in town that there was potentially a killer or killers on the loose. And so that night, Sunday evening, this news bulletin goes out and it basically just told residents of Gainesville to stay indoors and stay in groups. And if you needed to go outside, travel in groups, and just overall stay vigilant until we figure out who did this. 12 hours before Christine Powell and Sonia Larson were discovered, an 18-year-old Gainesville woman named Krista Hoyt did not show up for work. Krista was a student at Santa Fe Community College, which was right down the road from the University of Florida. That year, she was planning to transfer to the University of Florida, and then after graduation, she wanted to pursue a career in forensics with the FBI. And so given her interest in law enforcement, while she was a student, she had gotten a part-time job working in the records department of the sheriff's office. And apparently, at this sheriff's office, she was famous for always coming to work, no matter what, including the time that she got her wisdom teeth removed, and then an hour after coming home, she showed up for work. And so on this Saturday night, when Krista was supposed to be showing up for work and she didn't call ahead, and no one could get in touch with her on her landline, everybody at the sheriff's office was really concerned. And so they waited around for about an hour, hoping that she might just show up with some story about why she was late, but she never showed up. She didn't call. They still couldn't get in touch with her. And so in the very early hours of Sunday morning, the sheriff's office called the Gainesville police and asked them to do a welfare check on Krista. And so 2 police officers from the Gainesville Police Department, they show up at the apartment belonging to Krista Hoyt. Krista lived alone, and she lived about 2 miles away from Christine Powell and Sonia Larson. And so these 2 officers, they get there and they walk up to the front door and they knock, but there's no answer. And they try the doorknob, it's locked. And so one of the officers walks around to the back of this apartment and he sees there's a glass sliding door. And so he knocks on the glass sliding door, there's no answer. He tries the door, it's locked. And then he notices the drape that's inside the apartment that's covering up this sliding glass door. It reaches almost to the ground, but not all the way. There's a couple of inches on the bottom where if you were laying on the ground, you could actually look through this little space and see into the apartment. And so that's what he does. He lies down and he puts his flashlight up and he looks through this couple inch gap on this window. And as soon as the light illuminates what's inside of this apartment, he finds Krista. Krista is sitting on the edge of a bed that's not that far away from the sliding glass door, and she's facing the door. She's kind of hunched over at the edge of the bed. She's got no clothes on, and she's got stab marks all over her back, and she's missing her head. And her head was next to the bed to the left, up on the shelf, and it was positioned in such a way that it almost appeared like the head was looking down at the detached body. When this crime scene was processed, the forensics team immediately noticed there were marks on the back sliding glass door where someone had used probably a screwdriver or something similar to pop the door open. And then they also found residue of duct tape on Krista's wrists, but the duct tape was gone. She was found with her hands not bound. It would later be determined that Krista had been sexually assaulted before she had been murdered. The obvious similarities between Krista's crime scene and Christine and Sonia's crime scene were initially only recognized by Gainesville police because much of the information about the two crime scenes was not public. But that night, Sunday evening, when the police went to the media and asked them to put out that bulletin to all Gainesville residents to say that there could be a killer or killers on the loose, it didn't take long for residents of Gainesville and news anchors to begin speculating that you have these two murders that have happened really close together physically. They're less than 2 miles apart, and they've probably occurred within the last 24, 48 hours. So they've happened in rapid succession. They're both unsolved. And so even without intimate details of the crime scene, it wasn't hard to say, I think these two are probably connected. And so that night, Sunday evening, Gainesville really went into a state of panic. And within hours of this news, you had stores all over Gainesville that had sold out their deadbolts and locks, their mace, their stun guns, their baseball bats, their actual guns, their knives. I mean, people were really trying to arm themselves to protect themselves against this unknown threat that was murdering students in Gainesville. And the police, even though they did not come out and substantiate the claims that, perhaps these two homicides are connected, they did believe they were. And so that night, Sunday night, as all this chaos is kind of unfolding in town, the police put hundreds of officers all over the place, on foot on every street corner. They had police cars and trucks parked all over the place. I mean, the entire town was on an extreme heightened alert because the police believed another attack was imminent. And so all they could do was try to come out in force to try to discourage the killer or killers from striking again. But as it would turn out, it didn't work. By the following morning, so Monday morning, what was happening in Gainesville had gone from just being a Florida story to a national story, and everybody all over the country was talking about it. And one woman named Lisa Byers, who was in her 20s, she did not live in Gainesville, but she had a very close friend who did. She was 23-year-old Tracy Paulus. Tracy had taken some years off from college, but that year had decided to go back and give it another go. And so she was enrolled at the University of Florida. And so Lisa called Tracy and said, hey, I'm watching the news. This is crazy what's happening in your town. How are you holding up? And Tracy would tell her that, I'm just as concerned as everybody else. It's terrifying to think there are killer or killers on the loose, but I think I'm okay because I have my roommate. Tracy's roommate was 23-year-old Manny Taboda, who was this big, strong former football player who was very close with Tracy. The two had never dated, but they had been very good friends for a number of years. And he too had taken some time off of school and had agreed to go back because Tracy had convinced him, come back, get your degree with me and we'll live together. And so when the news broke about these killings happening in their town, Manny had told Tracy that he would protect her, that nothing would happen to her. And so when Lisa heard this from Tracy, that she thought that she was okay because she has Manny and, he'll look after her, and they were not planning to really leave the apartment much besides classes, Lisa was reassured, but she was still worried. And so she told Tracy, please give me a call this evening after you come back from classes just to let me know that everything is okay. And so Tracy said she would, and then they hung up. And then that evening, Tracy did not call Lisa back. So Lisa tried calling Tracy, but no one picked up. And so that night, Lisa went to bed. She was very worried, but she went to sleep. And then early the next morning, which was Tuesday morning, she tried calling Tracy again, but there was no answer. And so Lisa reached out to a mutual friend of theirs that lived in the same apartment complex in Gainesville. His name was Tommy. And so she asked Tommy, can you please go over to Tracy's apartment and make sure she and Manny are okay? And so Tommy said, no problem. I'll give you a call from Tracy's landline once I talk to her. And so about 5 minutes later, Tracy got a call. She picked it up, and it was Tommy calling from Tracy's landline, and he was just screaming. When the police arrived at Tracy's apartment, they found Tracy in her bedroom, and like the other victims, she had no clothes on. She was positioned on the side of the bed in a very suggestive, lewd position. She had been stabbed to death, and it would turn out she had been sexually assaulted. And then down the hall from Tracy, they found Manny. He was in his bed, and he too had been stabbed to death. Except he had his clothes on and he was not positioned in a suggestive position. He had kind of died wherever he was, and that was the position they found him in. The forensics team, when they processed the scene, they found markings on the outside of the back sliding door where it looked like someone had used a screwdriver to pop open the door. And then on Tracy's wrists, they found that residue from duct tape, but there was no duct tape. It had been removed. At this point, to the police, it was undeniable that they were up against a serial killer or killers. And when the news broke that there was now a fourth and fifth victim, and they were both college students, and one of them was now this big strapping man that apparently was taken down just as easily as these other four petite women, this threw Gainesville into an absolute state of pandemonium. Suddenly, it felt like no one could protect them. The people in Gainesville, they were fair game. It didn't matter that police were out in force in the streets, and you had people walking around with guns and baseball bats and mace, and you had people locking their doors and sleeping in groups. It was like no measures were actually stopping these killings from happening. Whoever was doing it was killing with impunity. And so that day, Tuesday, you had hundreds and hundreds of students from the University of Florida just leaving the school who just didn't come back. And as for the police, they called in the FBI and the National Guard. And so by that night, Tuesday night, there were literally hundreds of officers and state police officers all over the place. There were helicopters overhead, both police helicopters and news helicopters with spotlights. They had National Guard military-style trucks all over the place. And so Gainesville was really at the highest alert you could possibly be on. But even still, the people of Gainesville, they were not going to feel safe until the police made an arrest. And the next day, just 24 hours after Tracy and Manny had been found, the police did just that. After receiving dozens and dozens of tips about one particular individual, they were able to arrest 19-year-old Ed Humphreys, who was a freshman at the University of Florida. They arrested him for domestic abuse because he had actually struck his grandmother in the face. And so they pick him up for domestic abuse, but they set his bail at a whopping $1 million, which is way higher than you would normally expect for a domestic abuse charge. But this was a unique circumstance where he was being arrested for one thing, but really he was being looked at as the suspect of these 5 homicides. And so the police really needed him to stay behind bars. And this massive bail, that did that. He had no way to pay it. And so while Ed was behind bars, the police began investigating him, and they found there was a lot of reasons to believe he was the serial killer. He had shown he was willing to be violent because, after all, he punched his grandmother in the face, and people that knew him said he was totally mentally unstable and that he hated women and that he would walk around with a knife on his belt basically all the time. And at night, he was known to walk around the forest of Gainesville. There were these very thick forests that kind of butted up against the University of Florida, and he would walk through the forest at night, which put him very close to the different apartment buildings where all the victims were found. And on top of all that, Ed Humphreys just looked like what you would imagine a serial killer would look like. He had all these deep scars all over his face, and his eyes looked totally hollow, like he was permanently on drugs, and he was seen smiling at the cameras when he was led in and out of the courtroom. And to make him even more suspicious, as soon as he was arrested, the attack stopped. There were no more slayings in Gainesville. And so naturally, the country believed Ed was the guy. Basically, everyone thought Ed was the guy. But it came back that his blood type was type A, and the killer or killer's blood type, the blood that had been found at the various crime scenes, was type B. Now, this did not clear Ed of guilt because people believed there was a chance that, he could have been involved in some way. Perhaps he had an accomplice or multiple accomplices. But when this news broke, pretty much everybody was back on edge because clearly there's at least one or more killers that are still on the loose. Shortly after this blood type discrepancy presented itself, the FBI approached the Gainesville police and said, hey, why don't you use our VCAP program? VCAP stands for Violent Crime Apprehension Program. And what it was this computer program where it allowed investigators to input details of their crime they were investigating. And when they submitted it, it would be compared against this huge database of other crimes in the country. And if there were any similarities with any other crime, those similar crimes would get popped on screen. And so when the Gainesville police input the information from these 5 student slayings in Gainesville, the computer program spit out a single match. It was from an unsolved triple homicide in 1989 in Shreveport, Louisiana, which is a town located about 800 miles to the northwest of Gainesville. Shreveport, back in the late 1980s, was considered so safe by its residents that many of them didn't lock their front doors and they would leave their car keys just sitting on their front dash. But But in 1989, that would all change. On Friday, November 3rd of that year, 8-year-old Sean Grissom was dropped off at his grandfather's house in Shreveport. He was there to celebrate his 8th birthday. And so his grandfather was this 56-year-old man named Tom who was divorced, and he was getting ready to retire soon, and he was also trying to spend more time with his grandson. And so he was very excited about having Sean over. Also staying at this house with Sean and his grandfather was Sean's aunt, 24-year-old Julie Grissom, who was a college student. She was attending Louisiana State University in Shreveport. When Sean was dropped off by his mother at his grandfather's house, the grandfather, Tom, yelled out to the boy's mother and said, I'll have him back by Monday. I'll drop him off, see you later. And so Sean's mother, she leaves, and that day and the following day, she doesn't hear from Sean's grandfather or from Julie. And so come Sunday night, she tries calling them to, see what's going on. She knows they're having a great time and doesn't really want to interrupt them, but she also hasn't heard from them, but they don't pick up. She convinces herself that everything is just fine, that I'm sure there's an explanation. They're probably just having a great time. They don't want to call me. And so she ends up going to bed. And so the next morning, Monday morning, when Sean is supposed to be dropped off early enough that she can take him to school, when he doesn't show up, the mother calls the grandfather back and tries to get in touch and figure out what's going on, but she can't get in touch with him. And so she's telling herself that, okay, well, his grandfather must have just dropped him off at school. And so the mother calls Sean's school, and the school says, no, we have not seen Sean today, and we haven't heard from him, so we don't know what's going on. And so now Sean's mother is terrified. She calls the police, and the police actually get in touch with the neighbor of Tom Grissom, and they ask this neighbor, hey, can you go next door and just make sure Tom and Sean and Julie are okay? And so this neighbor says, no problem. They leave their house, and immediately they notice, as they're looking at Tom's house, that the 2 cars in the driveway had not left since Friday. It was just something the neighbor noticed. And then they also noticed that there were 2 newspapers at the end of the driveway. It was the Monday and Sunday paper. And they knew Tom always read the newspaper. And so the idea that he would just leave them sitting at the end of the driveway, that didn't really add up. And so the neighbor walks around to the front door, and they notice there are lights on inside, and they knock on the front door, but there's no answer. They try the front door, but it's locked. And so they end up going around to the very back of the house, and they're able to get into the house through the garage. And then through the garage, they open another door that leads into the main part of the house. And this neighbor, they immediately see on the ground towards the back door near the kitchen is Tom. He's laying on the ground, and he's obviously deceased. And so this neighbor, they run out, they call the police come back over, they go inside the house, and sure enough, they find Tom Grissom has been stabbed to death. He's laying on the ground near the back door. They find Sean Grissom, the 8-year-old, he's slouched over on the couch in front of the TV, and he's been stabbed to death as well. And then upstairs, they found 24-year-old Julie, the aunt, and she was positioned on the edge of the bed in this very suggestive way. She had no clothes on, and she had been stabbed to death, and it would later be determined she had also been sexually assaulted before she was killed. And they also discovered there's vinegar on her body, as if whoever's done this has attempted to clean her with vinegar. There was no sign of a robbery in the house or ransacking in the house. There was no sign of forced entry. Overall, the investigators said this was a very neat crime scene, as if whoever did this had done this with great intentionality. And so after kind of going through the crime scene, the police really didn't have any leads to go off of. And so this crime went unsolved. And so as these Gainesville police are looking at this report in this VCAP computer system, and they're reading about this unsolved triple homicide, all they can think about is how unbelievably similar the crime scene was to all the crime scenes of the student slayings. Specifically, that Julie had been arranged in this kind of suggestive pose like the other female victims in Gainesville. And on top of that, it was determined that the blood type of the killer in Shreveport was type B, same as the killer or killers in Gainesville. So there was a match in the blood type. Somehow, after this discovery through this VCAP program, the media found out about this Shreveport unsolved triple homicide and how apparently it was incredibly similar to all these slayings that have taken place in Gainesville. And so before long, that was all every news network all over the United States was talking about. And at first, the police in Gainesville and anybody involved in this investigation was very upset about this because 1, they probably had a leak that someone was giving information to the press, but 2, the press was was kind of jeopardizing their investigation, because by having these details leaked, the killer or killers could potentially benefit from kind of knowing what the police were thinking about and what they were up to. But as it would turn out, this particular leak would prove to be quite fruitful. Shortly after this news about the Shreveport killing and the student slayings was all over the news, this woman named Cindy, who lived in Shreveport, she called the police after watching all the news like everybody else, and told the police they really ought to look at this guy, Danny Rawling. Danny Rawling was this 37-year-old drifter who was in Shreveport at the time of the Grissom family murders in 1989, and apparently after those murders, he had told Cindy's husband that he, quote, had a problem, and his problem was he liked stabbing people. And Danny literally always walked around with a huge knife on his waist. He seemed totally mentally unstable. And so this claim that he liked stabbing people, Cindy and her husband took literally and basically told him to stay away from them. And so in one of their last conversations with Danny, Danny actually told Cindy that he planned to leave Shreveport and go someplace where there's lots of beautiful young women that he can just stare at all day long. And so when police asked Cindy, do you think he's capable of killing all 8 of these people? She said, oh yeah. And so the police turned their attention to Danny and began researching his background, and they discovered he was raised in a very abusive household. Specifically, his father really couldn't stand him. They had a really bad relationship. And then when Danny got old enough, he joined the Air Force, but he was kicked out after 2 years for being mentally unstable. And once he was discharged, he began the string of armed robberies in the 1980s, and he eventually got caught and spent the bulk of the 1980s in prison. And then in 1989, when he got out of prison, he came back to Shreveport and moved in with his parents. Now, this was not a happy homecoming. His parents did not want him living with them, but Danny kind of forced the issue. He had nowhere else to go, and so he wound up living there. And as it happened, they lived less than a half-mile away from the Grissom family home. 6 months after the Grissom family was murdered, and 3 months before the Gainesville student slayings had begun, Danny gets in this huge fight with his father, where his father actually draws a pistol and forces Danny to leave the house and tells him to never come back. And so Danny, he runs out of the house and he gets his gun from his vehicle, comes back inside his house and shoots his father point blank in the head and then in the stomach before fleeing the scene. His father would amazingly survive this attack despite some pretty significant damage to his head, and he would tell the police, and before long there was a warrant for Danny's arrest for attempted murder. But when they went to go arrest him, he was gone. They had no idea where he went. And so as the Gainesville police are looking at Danny's criminal record, they're starting to say to themselves that this guy looks really interesting. He does seem like he could be the serial killer we're looking for. And so as they continue to dig deeper and deeper, one of the Gainesville police officers suddenly thinks of something. There was this unsolved armed robbery of this bank in Gainesville that happened the same week where all 5 of the students had been killed. A lone masked gunman walked into this bank in broad daylight and demanded money from the teller, and the teller, who thought on their feet, gave him the cash, but it was the type that was booby-trapped with dye packets, meaning if this robber tried to tamper with the money at all, it would detonate, sending dye all over them and kind of making it obvious that this money had been stolen. But the robber doesn't see this. He takes the bag of cash, he leaves the bank, and manages to flee and go into the forest before the police show up. And so the police ultimately, they go and search the forest, and they find this campsite deep in the woods. And at this campsite, which is abandoned, they don't find the person who robbed the bank, but at this campsite, they find the bag that has the money inside of it, and the dye packet has been activated. So clearly the robber had tried to fiddle with it, and then when it detonated, they had taken off and left the money. And then also at this campsite, near this duffel bag full of ruined money, was a screwdriver, a gun, and an audio recorder. Now, at the time, the police that were seeing this, they were part of this huge effort in Gainesville to stop any more attacks on students and catch the killer or killers. That was all they were thinking about. And so when they didn't immediately catch this robber, they kind of said, you know what? This is a lower priority item than what we're dealing with this loose serial killer or killers. And so let's just round up the evidence, put it in storage, and somebody else can deal with this after we handle this killer situation. And so no one listened to the audio recording. They just put it in evidence. They grabbed everything else, put it in evidence, and they threw it in the storage room. And so now this Gainesville police officer that's just remembered this unsolved armed robbery, he says to the group that's investigating Danny, he says, hey, since Danny has a penchant for armed robbery, clearly he has a rap sheet full of armed robberies, maybe if he was the serial killer and he killed all these students, that would have meant he was in Gainesville, and so maybe he committed this armed robbery. And so we should go look at the evidence and listen to that tape. And so the officers, they practically run to the storage locker. They get the evidence from this unsolved armed robbery. They come back and they hit play on this audio recorder. And what they hear is unbelievable. They hear on this recording a man singing a song. It's clearly a song he wrote, and he's singing about being a, quote, mystery killer. And then it kind of segues into him talking about how to effectively kill a deer with a knife, to be really effective with a knife. And he's getting into really graphic detail of how to do that. And then, somewhat unbelievably, on this audio recording, the man identifies himself. He says his name is Danny Rawling. And so this audio recording was huge. It meant Danny Rawling, the guy they're looking at as potentially being the serial killer, was definitely in Gainesville, in the woods near the University of Florida, the same time frame that all of the victims were killed. Also, the screwdriver that had been found at this campsite matched the markings that had been made along the outside of some of the door frames of the victims' homes. They also went into Danny's military records, and it showed he had a blood type of B. So his blood type matched the blood type that had been found in all of the victims' homes. And so just like that, Danny became the number one suspect. And when they went to figure out where he was, amazingly, they found he was already in custody. He was being held in a jail cell 40 miles south of Gainesville for another armed robbery. And so immediately, Danny was charged in the murders of the 5 Gainesville students. They couldn't charge him for the 3 Shreveport murders because they just didn't have enough evidence. And then after that, Danny was transferred to Florida's maximum security prison to await trial. Initially, Danny said he was innocent, he had nothing to do with the murders, but then almost 4 years later, when his trial was finally starting on the first day of his trial, he surprised everyone in the court when he stood up and said, "I'm going to change my plea. I'm guilty on all 5 counts. I did kill all 5 students." He would tell the court the reason he did this is he wanted to be a superstar like the notorious serial killer Ted Bundy, who he looked up to. Danny would also, at another date, confess to killing the 3 Grissom family members in Shreveport. Because of Danny's detailed confessions, we now know all the terrifying details of what actually happened when he killed all 8 of his victims. Back on Friday, November 3rd, 1989, Danny was fired from his job as a waiter at a local restaurant in Shreveport. And so he was frustrated, he was angry, and he was kind of walking around his neighborhood when he decided the way he would kind of channel his frustration was he would go kill some people. And so he was armed with his K-bar knife, which he always carried with him. And he found himself standing in front of this little house, and he saw some people moving around inside. And he looked around, there wasn't anyone watching him. And so he just walked up to the front door, he tried the handle, and it was unlocked. And so before he opened the door, he made sure his knife was in hand. He opened the door, walked right in, and he saw Sean, the 8-year-old, sitting on the couch watching TV. And without any hesitation, he walked up behind him and stabbed him through the back, killing him almost instantly. And then Danny walked into the kitchen where he found Tom, the grandfather, who was making steaks out on the back grill. And so he was going back and forth between the kitchen and the grill, kind of getting ready for dinner. And at some point, when Tom came back into the house and was holding steaks in his hand, Danny leapt out and stabbed him, and even though Tom put up a fight, he was very quickly subdued as well. And then after that, Danny made his way upstairs where Julie was, that was Sean's aunt, and she was getting ready for a wedding she was going to attend that night for one of her friends. And so she had just gotten out of her shower and she was getting ready to put on this red dress she had picked out, and Danny walked into her room and she most likely saw him, at which point Danny would have told her what he had just done to her loved ones downstairs, and he threatened her with the knife and said, "If you don't listen to me, I'm going to do the same thing to you." And because she was terrified, she listened to him, and so he immobilized her, and then he sexually assaulted her, and then he stabbed her to death. Afterwards, he cuts the tape off of her wrists and puts the tape in his pocket, and then he lays her out on her back on her bed, and then he goes downstairs and gets some vinegar and uses the vinegar to attempt to clean her body, to destroy any evidence he might have left behind. And then after cleaning her, he kind of puts her in that lewd, suggestive pose with her hands up over her head and her legs spread, and then he leaves. 6 months later, in August of 1990, after Danny has shot his father and is on the run from the law, he finds himself in Gainesville, Florida, and he sets up this little camp just behind the University of Florida in this thick forest. And then on Friday, August 23rd, as he's sitting out at his campsite, he gets this sudden urge to go kill again. And so he waits for it to get dark out, and then he gets out his audio recorder and he records himself alluding to this murder he is about to go perpetrate. Then, armed with a pistol, a screwdriver, and his K-bar knife, he left his campsite and walked in the darkness in the forest about a mile away until he was looking from inside the forest out towards this 3-story white apartment building. And it's believed that within the last 24 hours, he had been in that area and he had seen 2 young girls go in and out of this apartment building, and that was all he needed to determine who his victims were going to be. And so those victims were Christine Powell and Sonia Larson. And so when he was standing in front of their apartment building, he eventually strode out of the forest. He walked up to that access door that led him into that stairwell. He made his way up to the door of Christine and Sonia, and he used his screwdriver to pop the door open. He went inside and shut the door behind him and walked into the living room, and he found Christine was sleeping on the couch. And so he left her be. He didn't touch her. He went upstairs and he found Sonia sleeping on her bed. And so as he's standing there, realizing that he has these 2 girls, he needs to make a decision about which one he's going to kill first and which one he's going to sexually assault. And so as he's standing there looking over Sonia's bed, he decides he's going to kill Sonia and then he's going to sexually assault Christine. And so very casually, he walks into Sonia's room. She's fast asleep. She's on her back. And he pulls out a piece of duct tape. And he gets the duct tape in one hand and he pulls his knife out in the other. And he presses the duct tape over her mouth, which wakes her up. And then he drives the knife into her chest. And so Sonia would put up a pretty incredible fight, but ultimately she would succumb to her injuries. And then after she was dead, Danny just left her where she was. And he went downstairs and he found Christine was still asleep on the couch. She had not woken up from the commotion upstairs. And so he walked right in front of her, and standing over her with his knife, he kind of nudged her awake. And when she woke up, he had a piece of tape, he put it over her mouth, and he told her to be quiet and held up the knife and told her that I just killed your roommate, and if you don't listen to what I'm going to say, I'm going to kill you too. And so naturally, she complied to what he wanted, and so she let her wrists be tied, and then at that point, he cut her clothes off, he sexually assaulted her, and then he stabbed her to death. And so after she was dead on the ground, he went and got that towel and that soap, and he began cleaning Christine's body to try to remove any evidence he might have left behind. And then he cut the duct tape off of her wrist and removed the duct tape from her mouth and put those in his pocket. And then he positioned her in that kind of lewd, suggestive position that she was found in. And then Danny went back upstairs and cut the clothes off of Sonia and then positioned her on the side of the bed in a suggestive position as well. And then Danny leaves the apartment. So he goes back into the woods. He walks in the wood line back to his campsite. But when he got there, he was just too jacked up. He was too excited from what he had just done that he just couldn't control himself. All he wanted to do was go out and kill again. And so he managed to sit at his campsite for a total of 8 hours before he couldn't help it any longer. He had to go back out and find another victim. And so his next victim, he decided, would be this woman he just happened to see a couple of days ago. He was walking down the road near this row of apartments near the school, and he looked into one of them, and he just saw there was this girl in this apartment, and he just thought for a second, I bet she lives alone there. But that was the entire interaction. He didn't know this person. He was just kind of guessing that she might be alone in there. And so here he is in the forest after killing these 2 teens, and he's like, okay, I'm going to go back to that apartment because I think that woman is alone. And that woman would be Krista Hoyt. And so in the early morning hours of Saturday, August 24th, Danny leaves his campsite with his screwdriver, his gun, and his K-bar knife, and he walks about a half mile away from his campsite until he's still in the woods, but he's looking out at the back of Krista's apartment. And then at some point, he walks out of the forest, he walks right up over her fence and gets up to her back sliding door. He uses a screwdriver to pop the sliding door open. He slides it open, he steps inside, and he finds out that Krista is actually not in her apartment. There's no one in her apartment. But instead of leaving and finding another victim, he decides he'll just wait for Krista. And so he shuts the sliding back door and he goes into her bedroom closet and shuts the closet and then just waits. And he stays in her closet for several hours until around 11 a.m. that morning. Krista comes home, and when she was in the house, he waited a little bit longer to make sure she didn't know he was there. And then at some point, he kind of slipped out of the closet, snuck up behind her, and put her in a chokehold. Now, at first, Krista tried to fight back, but eventually she realized she could not overpower whoever this was. And at that point, she said, okay, what do you want? And Danny would tell her, you got to listen to me or I'm going to kill you. And he showed her the knife. And so Krista said, okay. And she put her wrists out. He taped her wrists with duct tape. He put tape over her mouth. And then he brought her into her bedroom where he cut her clothes off and sexually assaulted her. And then afterwards, he stabbed her to death. Once she was dead, he cut the duct tape off of her wrists and pulled the duct tape off of her mouth and put that duct tape in his pocket. And then he positioned her body on the bed in a suggestive position before he left. When he got back to his campsite, he realized he had accidentally left his wallet in Krista's apartment. And so, calm as can be, he walked back through the forest, right back into Krista's apartment. He found his wallet and he was about to leave when he thought to himself, well, wait a minute, I should mutilate her body. And so he pulled Krista's body off of the bed, and using his knife, he decapitated her. He put her head up on the shelf next to the bed, and then he repositioned her body on the edge of the bed, making it seem like she was kind of hunched over, looking out the back door. And then before he left, he reached up and twisted her decapitated head and made it seem like it was looking down at the rest of her body. 48 hours later, on the evening of Monday, August 27th, Danny was back at his campsite out in the woods, and he suddenly got the urge to go kill again. And so he stood up, he grabbed his knife, his screwdriver, and his gun, and he walked away from camp, made it about a mile through the woods until he was standing still in the forest, looking out at this big apartment complex that was very commonly occupied by college students. And so at some point, he leaves the forest and walks up to the first apartment he sees. He has no idea who's going to be in there, and he goes up to their sliding back glass door. He gets a screwdriver out and he pops it open. He slides the door open. He steps inside, and the first thing he sees is Manny Taboda, this big, strong former football player who's laying in his bed. And Danny just walks over and starts stabbing him, and Manny wakes up and puts up one heck of a fight, but ultimately Danny is able to overpower him and kills him. While Danny was stabbing Manny, the other resident inside of this apartment, 23-year-old Tracy Paulus, she was in the shower, and so she gets out of the shower and she hears all this commotion down the hall, and so she steps into the hall and she looks into Manny's room and she sees Danny on top of him, stabbing him. And so Danny looks back, he sees Tracy. Tracy screams, she runs down the hall into her bedroom, she slams the door behind her, she locks it, and then she leans up against the door to try to keep it shut. Meanwhile, Danny just continues to stab Manny until Manny is dead. And then Danny stands up and he just walks down the hall, calm as can be. He gets to the bedroom door where he knows Tracy is. She's trapped, she can't go anywhere. And he begins to smash the door down. He's ramming it with his shoulder, he's kicking it over and over again, and Tracy's screaming for him to stop. But eventually, he manages to just kick the door down. And as soon as he's inside the room, Tracy kind of stands back and she says to Danny, "Are you the one?" And Danny looks at her and says, "Yes, I am the one." And then he threatened her with the knife and said, "I'll kill you just like the guy down the hall unless you listen to me." And so Tracy listened. She got her wrists bound and her face bound. And then Danny cut the clothes off of her and then sexually assaulted her. And then he stabbed her to death. And then after she was dead, he cut the duct tape off of her wrists and removed the duct tape from her mouth and then positioned her body in a suggestive sexual position on the edge of the bed. And then he left. Later that day, Danny would rob that bank in Gainesville, and then 1 month later, Danny would be arrested for a botched armed robbery 40 miles south of Gainesville, and then while he was in prison, he would find out he was being charged with the 5 murders in Gainesville. 16 years later, at 6 p.m. on October 25th, 2006, Danny Rawling was led into the execution chamber in Florida State Prison. He offered no apology to the family members of his victims that were on the other side of the glass. Instead, Danny just sang a religious hymn to himself in order to comfort himself. And then 13 minutes later, Danny was pronounced dead. He was executed via lethal injection. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin podcast. If you enjoyed this episode and you haven't done this already, please hide outside of the 5-star review button's house when they're watching Game 7 of the World Series. And every time the game starts to get really good, change the channel using your universal remote. Also, please subscribe to the Mr. Ballin podcast on Spotify, iTunes, Google, Amazon, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories I have posted on my YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballin. If you want to get in touch with me, you can send me a direct message on any major social media platform. My username for all of them is just @MrBallen. And yes, I really do read the majority of my direct messages.